Americans, except on our drone planes, which are kind of sexy, these are new wonder weapons. We pay no attention to air war, but we've in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we've bombed countrysides, we've bombed cities in Iraq, and in the case of Tom Dispatch, I think I may be the only website in the United States or on the planet, I don't know, that's tried to count the number of wedding parties that the American Air Force has knocked out in Iraq and Afghanistan. I got up to about 7. I find this shocking, but here we are incredibly detached from the wars that we fight. And as long as we are thinking in terms of our own safety, we think very little about wedding parties, funerals, baby naming parties. I mean, all of these things are because air war is the least, despite what you hear about smart bombs and, precision-guided weaponry, if you're going to fight from the air, and that is part of the American way of war, you are going to kill civilians, period. And you're going to probably kill them in greater numbers than any other way. That's just a fact of war, I would say.
I'd like to get back to this question you raised of the garrison state, and obviously, as the United States move more and more toward a professional as opposed to a drafted army, more Americans have become disconnected from the reality of the American military machine around the world. But how extensive is the garrison state, or remind some of our viewers and listeners about that?
It's very striking. I mean, the Pentagon, depending on what year you look at their reports, they fess up to 700-odd sites, they'd call them, bases large and small. And these go from fairly small sites or places where they may even cache weapons or something without a lot of human beings to what in essence are enormous American towns. I mean, at one point, Balad Air Base in Iraq, with maybe 20,000 people there, troops, contractors, whatever, had the air traffic of O'Hare Airport in Chicago. I mean, these are enormous places, 15, 20 miles around with bus routes, PXs, massage parlors, some of them are quite extraordinary. And those 700-odd bases don't include, in fact, Balad. They don't include bases in war zones. We had at our height about 300 bases, large to small, in Iraq, and we've been in a building frenzy since the surge in Afghanistan. So we have now, Nick Terse of Tom Dispatch has estimated 400 bases. These are from micro to macro in Afghanistan, and we're not stopping. To give you a simple example, the Special Forces, Army Special Forces, are supposed to get a $100 million base built for them, 17 acres in northern Afghanistan, which will be done, since it's just starting now, it will be done about the time that President Obama claims that we're going to start withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. So our basing around the world it's really staggering. I would guess maybe if you include war zones and also countries that don't admit, it's just uncomfortable. Jordan doesn't want to say there's an American base there. It's just awkward. Pakistan, we share bases, so not counted as a base. Maybe 1,200 or more. That would be my guess, including the war zones. And this is unprecedented historically. I mean, I think Britain had 40 bases around the world. The Romans, to go back to, since these are the two things that we were compared to back in 2003, 2004, 37 or 38. I mean, that was a lot. Then there's nothing like this. I mean, and we of course don't take territory. It's a very odd kind of imperial structure. We take bases. There are gunboats pushed deep into land. The gunboats that the Europeans used to take much of the world, 17th, 18th, 19th century, these are our land gunboats.
You write about the Bush legacy, what Bush did wrong, and then you move to Obama's war.
Yeah, I do. Well, I mean, what's interesting is you've got two men who couldn't, in many ways, I think we can agree, we're not talking about Tweedledum and Tweedledee, we're talking about two people with remarkably different persona, thought processes, and whatever. What's startling is, given all that, and given that they're coming at each of these problems, the war problems, from a different perspective, how often they land at the same place. And I think that tells you that there's a kind of momentum, like the momentum to build that base in northern Afghanistan, there's a war momentum which has the potential to sweep any president along. I mean, in fact, the Obama administration has followed the policies of really the last part of the Bush administration, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe even hiked Afghanistan farther than the Bush people would. I mean, the surge in Afghanistan, we usually hear about 30,000 troops. That's what's talked about. But the actual surge in Afghanistan was a surge in troops. It was a surge in CIA operations. It was a surge in special forces operations. It was a large surge in contractors. There was a large surge in base building. There was a significant surge in trying to send in State Department people, and when they couldn't find them, Pentagon people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the level of the surge in this war is bigger than we imagine. And it does seem like a kind of war momentum. And it does seem to me as if we are in both a war state, with Washington as the war capital, and an eternal permanent state of war at this point. And Americans are largely unaware of that.
And yet, a startling article in the Washington Post a few days ago about the situation in Marja, where supposedly the Agency for International Development has funding for 10,000 jobs for the local citizens, but they're having trouble recruiting people. They tried to organize a women's group in the town, and no women would show up. They were ready to provide water pumps, hundreds of water pumps for residents, and no one would take them because they were afraid that the water pumps would be assigned to the Taliban, that they were collaborating with the U.S. government. So in essence, even the pacification efforts of the government are failing in the town that they noted as the example of where they were going to roll back the gains of the Taliban.
This was to be the success, and then they were to move on to Kandahar. Now, this area, Marja, that you're talking about, it was presented as a city or a town of 80,000 people. It seems clearly now to be a set of connected agricultural villages of maybe 35 to 40,000 people. We threw 15,000 troops in, which should, from a counterinsurgency handbook standpoint, be right. You know, about one troop for every 2 or 3 people in the area. And as you say, it's not worked. Now, our next offensive, theoretically, recently delayed, is to be in Kandahar. But think of Kandahar as Detroit. I mean, numbers are almost unknown in Afghanistan, but Kandahar has between 500,000 million people. It's an enormous city. It's not a Taliban-controlled city either, weirdly enough. When we say we're going to take it, it's in some in-between state. And I think the truth is that we have, in Afghanistan, we have a set of tactics, which we call counterinsurgency. They're procedures, you might say, and they're out of a kind of a warmed-over Vietnam textbook. But I think basically that this administration and its soldiers, they're in the kind, you know, they talked about rolling out a government in a box. That was what our war commander said in Marja. They're in a kind of a box. I talked to a journalist coming back from Afghanistan recently who said, you know, they cannot see outside the American box in Afghanistan, and I honestly don't think they know what they're doing. The Bush people, the one thing you can say about them is they were visionaries in a sense. I mean, they were, you might call them mad visionaries, but they had a vision of the whole planet. It was a geopolitical vision. It involved energy flows, what countries you would take, who you would roll back. It involved the use of American power. It led to various disasters. This administration is like managing that war momentum, but I actually don't think they have a large vision at all of how the world's working. I don't feel any of that. I feel a deep sense of confusion. And in Washington, there is starting to be some discussion of that now, of the actual strategic confusion of the Bush administration.
Well, you know, I'm thinking of Helen Thomas's last questioning of President Obama when she asked about why we're in Afghanistan and talked again about the casualties and who will keep raising these questions. But Obama gave a lesson on, well, we're attacking the enemy. We're attacking those that us on September 11th, and we must prevail.
Yeah, it's the same line about Al-Qaeda. I mean, the advantage of Al-Qaeda, if you look at it again in the Soviet perspective, the Soviet Union disappeared and there was no enemy left in the world. A few rogue states like North Korea who became the axis of evil sooner or later. But they were very small. They were like wimps in the world. The advantage of Al-Qaeda, which really was a ragtag outfit of, you know, a few thousand people scattered around the world, and, you know, some in Afghanistan, after 9/11 was it could be blown up to any size. So it was a very convenient enemy to begin to enter a kind of a war state. And it's been that way. I think, quite honestly, the real question in Afghanistan is not are we doing well or are we doing badly, but why are we doing anything in Afghanistan when, you know, it is the backlands of the world. That money we desperately need here. And the truth is, we would be a lot safer in a million different ways if in fact, in 1991, we had not put our money into the military and the military-industrial complex. We had put it into a peace dividend. Imagine where we'd be now, you know, just as in